I couldn't work out how my secrets were ending up in the newspaper, and my most kind of deeply held, those shameful secrets that I had pried from my chest, believing they were safe and obviously believing I was doing this in confidence. I became very paranoid, began to search my house for bugs, recording devices, began to wear a scarf and look around me when I was walking. I didn't know if people were following me. I would check my flatmates' phones and my boyfriend's phone in case they had numbers of journalists or they'd been texting someone I didn't recognise. As the case continued, more accurate articles began to appear in the press, and it just began to kind of crystallize as this ball in my stomach of this is not okay and I need to find out how this has happened. I googled journalism courses. I thought I will become a journalist myself and I will find this out.
Hi, and welcome to Lives Less Ordinary on the BBC World Service YouTube channel, with me, Asya Fuchs. Today, I'm talking to Jenny Evans. Jenny was a young actress who'd just been cast in her first feature film when she was sexually assaulted by a high-profile figure. After she reported the assault to the police, details of her confidential police statement appeared in a national newspaper just days later. Shocked and confused by this new violation, Jenny decided to retrain as a journalist to uncover how it had happened. Her investigation helped to expose corruption within the British press and police. Jenny, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
We're really happy to have you with us. You grew up in a small town in Wales. Could you tell me a little bit about those early years?
I was lucky enough to have a very safe and secure and loving childhood. So I lived with my mum and my dad and my brother Will in South Wales in a lovely town called Abergavenny.
And at what point does acting, does drama come into your life?
I quite liked performing, making people laugh. Started going to a drama club outside of school, which was entirely free. I think it really became a means of self-expression.
And then when you're 18, you get cast in this funny, violent, quirky film. How did you think that your life was going to change after that? Was that like, I don't know, was there the sense of the world opening up to you?
That's exactly it. I mean, I think at that point, the kind of very safe, secure childhood had slightly shifted and changed. My dad had died. Um, I was really struggling with kind of taking academia very seriously or seeing it as very important at that time. And then I dropped out of my A levels twice. And really kind of, I didn't have many pathways or many choices. And yeah, suddenly my interest in drama provided this route out, hopefully, of my hometown and a change in kind of pace, access to London and London people and a profession potentially. So it was really exciting and it was the change of gear that I desperately needed at that time, actually.
Shortly after the release of the film, believe you're 19 at the time. You're still living in Wales with your mom, but you're in London on a night out with the production crew. Um, can you tell me about that night?
This is the night of the sexual assault.
Yes.
Yeah, it started off at a barbecue. I was invited to a barbecue by one of the crew members at her house. And then we all went off to a pub afterwards. In fact, she stayed behind for personal reasons, but she sent me off with a friend of hers. I mean, I was 19 and I was, I suppose, fairly naive and new to London. And so I felt safe. And we had a nice time. And then we all ended up back at the house of one of the people who'd been there the whole day. In the book, I call him the famous man, a musician and
Someone unconnected to the film.
unconnected to the film. I mean, I recognized him. He was a famous man, but he just happened to be there in amongst the group of people who'd been at the barbecue and then at the pub. So we all went back to his house, and my chaperone left very quickly in a way that was a bit confusing to me. And I did chase after her actually when I had a moment to kind of think, but she'd gone. And so I went back in, and there was only the famous man and his friend there left at that point. So I asked for a taxi, and they refused to give me a taxi number, which I also was finding very confusing. I didn't have a mobile phone that time. And yeah, the situation just became very tense. So he kept reaching his phone out and I kept trying to take it and he kept putting it behind his back. And then he would take a step towards me and I would take a step back. And I was just starting to realize this is feeling tense and I'm feeling a bit frightened when my legs hit a coffee table. And then I always remember what happened next, kind of both in slow motion and really fast. Like he put his hand to my chest and just pushed me so that I would lose my footing. And then he and his friend kind of pounced, I suppose. Yeah, and then there was a sexual assault.
I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry that happened to you.
Thank you. Yeah.
You do manage to leave that house, and a kind cab driver, he takes you home.
Yeah.
What do you remember about him, and how he responded to you?
His name was Ken. I was in a state, and I was in a state of shock. So I can remember very clearly looking in the wing mirror, and my mascara was all down my face, and my lipstick was all around my chin. I was shaking. I'd been retching when he picked me up. And so he kept saying to me, I think you've been raped. Let me take you to a police station. And I just couldn't speak. So he repeated that gently several times, and I asked him for a cigarette. Then I knocked the end of the cigarette off into the car, burning my dress, and we had to stop the car, get out, and he had to. There was a whole thing, and in the end, I just told him I need to sleep. So I got him to take me back to the crew member's house where I had started at the barbecue where I was meant to be staying. That's the choice I made in that moment. I was too shocked and too scared, and I had a kind of base level scared of the famous man and his friend to be going to a police station and like telling on them at that point.
You did keep his name and phone number, Ken's name and phone number?
Yeah, he gave me his card and said, if you ever need me to testify about the state that you're in right now, let me know. And I did, ultimately I did report, and I gave that card to the police, but he had died.
Oh. How were you doing in the days and weeks afterwards?
I think the shock lasted a long time. I think that's quite common. I understand that to be quite common now. So I was slightly disbelieving. I think I very quickly, a steel trap closed in my head, and I just decided that nothing that bad had happened. And, even if it had, I was fine. And so the fact that there were kind of bruises and scratches, bruises emerging and scratches, I found that almost like a dissonance. Like, why would these be here? Because nothing that bad had happened. So I stayed in shock, I think, for the first kind of days and weeks, and it would take me a number of years to recover to the extent that I could talk about it in any way.
What followed were, some difficult kind of lost years, but you eventually, you enroll in drama school, and you kind of start finding your footing again. And it's while you're at drama school and you're out with some friends that you actually discover that the famous man has been accused of assaulting other women. How do you find out?
I found out because a friend brought the late edition of a newspaper into the student bar where I was kind of dancing and drinking with other friends, and dropped it on the table. And yeah, famous man accused of rape. And apparently I went green.
How did finding this out, that it wasn't just you, how did it alter your understanding of what had happened to you?
Well, I had thought that I had got myself into a dangerous situation, which is, again, a very classic response to sexual assault, because it happens to you, right? It happens to your body. And so on some level you think, well, this must be happening because I have in some way asked for it or deserve it. Seeing that newspaper headline was the first time I realised, this man might be serially violent. There might be other people out there who he's hurt. Yeah, that was a very shocking thing to imagine. I'd been so on my own with it, holding it so close to my chest, barely able to speak about it. So it was very shocking to realise it was bigger than me.
And is it at that point that you decide to report what had happened to you to the police?
I was frightened. It took me 2 days to decide to do that, actually. I spent 2 sleepless nights just kind of staring at the ceiling in my bedroom, just like, what do I do? What do I do? What do I do? And in the end, I decided that I probably had a moral obligation to report. But there is no moral obligation to report, just to be clear. Most people don't want to report or ever talk about sexual violence, and that is okay. That's where I got to in my mind, and I decided that perhaps other people would be coming forward because the newspapers were full of it, and so it suddenly became clear that actually everybody, like so many people, knew that he had a reputation for being dangerous. And so I thought, well, if I go to the police, then I'll probably be adding my name to a list.
Kind of safety in numbers,
right?
The numbers kind of thing.
So I'll just go and do that because perhaps other people are doing that, and then we'll see where it goes.
What was that experience like of reporting your assault to the police?
It was not enjoyable. I remember very clearly, approaching the police station and the smell of the lino and of the floor and of the bleach and of the people and of kind of how harried and stressed the desk sergeant was and how unemotional. So I kind of croaked out to this guy I'd like to report an assault, and he sent me into a side room, and a very nice female detective met me with a notebook, and I told her everything, and she said, "I believe you. That's the first thing you have to know." And it was a huge sense of relief to do that, to hear that. But she said, "You may have to if you want to take this further, we may have to interview you again and do a filmed interview at a different police station with a different police person." Heart sank, didn't want to do it again. But I did. There was a male detective, but he seemed very nice, quite businesslike, and they broke it down into detail and into facts, and it was all very anatomical, and I found it all very embarrassing and stressful. And at that point, I do think I was reliving stuff that I hadn't thought about for a long time that was stored in my body. Like on one level, I thought about it all the time, and on another level, I spent a lot of time in my mind just trying to push it away.
And at this point in your life, had you told many people about the assault?
No, I hadn't. I can't remember how many. I had told my brother when it happened. He had since died. It was him dying that was my catalyst to go to university and start trying to live my life again after the assault. I had told my mum, but I had played it down to my mum because I didn't want her to know the extent of it, and I didn't want to admit the extent of it to myself. I think I had shown a friend in my hometown some of the marks on my body, and I had written a letter to a dear friend. But no, I hadn't spoken that truth very much, and it was difficult even to hear it come out of my mouth.
So a few days after that second police interview, you're lying in bed, reading the papers, and what do you see?
Yeah, so at that time I was a student and I didn't have much money, and my boyfriend and I used to spend a lot of time reading newspapers in bed because it was cheap. We used to listen to the radio. It was him. He picked up one of the tabloids, the trashier newspapers, and he turned to look at me, and he said, "I didn't know there was two of them." And it took me a moment to realise what he meant. He meant two attackers, and within this newspaper were details of what I had told the police. So not my name, but my most kind of deeply held, those shameful secrets that I had pried from my chest 4 days before. It was 4 days. Believing they were safe, and obviously believing I was doing this in confidence. They were printed in a national newspaper for everyone to read, including my boyfriend at that time, who vaguely knew that something had happened to me, but didn't know there were two. I mean, you don't keep secrets for yourself. You sometimes keep them to protect other people, right? So, yeah, my allegations were printed in the national press.
How did you make sense of that in the moment? It seems like your brain would do like a "this does not compute" kind of thing.
Yeah, again, it's like a cold shower of shock. You're just trying to work out like how it happened, and what trying to go through in your head what you've told other people, and might somebody have told the newspaper, but hardly anyone knew you were going to the police, and the level of detail that you speak to the police about is a different level of detail to how you talk to your friends. I I couldn't work it out. How did they know? I did call the detective who was the kind of the lead detective and say to him, this thing has happened. And he said, I'll come back to you. It sounds very serious. But he never did come back to me. And I was so young and naive, I didn't push him on it. Um, I don't, yeah, it was terrifying.
And how did it change sort of the way that you went about your life, the way you carried yourself in the world?
It changed everything. So I became very paranoid. I began to search my house for bugs, recording devices. I began to close the curtains every morning instead of open them. Or, if someone else had opened them, I would close them. After a while, I began to wear a scarf and look around me when I was walking. I didn't know if people were following me. I would check my flatmates' phones and my boyfriend's phone in case they had numbers of journalists or they'd been texting someone I didn't recognize. Again, if I'd thought that through, it didn't make logical sense because they didn't all know the details. They all vaguely knew something bad had happened to me, but I couldn't work it out. I thought maybe my phone was being live tapped because I'd been speaking to my mum on the phone, and I didn't know if that was possible. I couldn't work out how my secrets were ending up in the newspaper, and that one article wasn't the only one that happened. As the case continued and the famous man was charged, more accurate articles began to appear in the press, and I couldn't work out how they got there.
As you're living in this sort of like increasingly paranoid state, the police come to you and they tell you that there's enough evidence to charge the famous man, but it would just be you. The other women's cases, their accounts, they don't meet the charging threshold, so there wouldn't be the safety in numbers. There wouldn't be the adding your name to a list. How do you take that news, and do you still trust the police enough to go forward with them in this process?
I did, because they were looking me in the eye, and they were saying, we're on your side and we believe you and this is very important and you're very brave. And I became very aware that I represented everybody he'd ever hurt, and I now knew there were many. So I didn't know how many. And so again, that kind of moral obligation thing kicked in, and so I said I would go ahead with it. Yeah, but I was frightened and I felt very, very alone.
As you're getting ready to take the case to trial, you meet up with an old friend. This is a friend you mentioned that you wrote a letter to about what had happened, and you're there. She hands you this letter. What does the letter say, and why is it significant?
So she thought it was brilliant evidence, and I had written, again in very vague terms, not a level of detail in any way, but I had written to her about multiple instances of sexual trauma that I had experienced, because with the experience with the famous man and his friend was not the only I had experienced, to varying degrees of seriousness. But it was really a kind of soul-searching letter. This particular friend is 10, 11 years older than me. And it was like, why would these things have happened to me? Would this happen multiple times? Why would I be a target multiple times? And she was just like, here it is in black and white. Here's you talking about this thing from the famous man years ago. Doesn't it prove that it happened? Because one of the allegations that he was saying, this is a bandwagon and these people are making it up. They just want money. They just want fame. And she was saying, this proves that you've been talking about this for a lot longer. So we thought it was brilliant evidence. So I kind of excitedly gave it to the detective and my police team.
This piece of brilliant evidence.
This piece of brilliant evidence, like, this proves, doesn't it, that this happened.
How did they respond?
They responded with very blank faces, and kind of shifting uncomfortably and exchanging glances. And
did you know right away that this wasn't the brilliant evidence you had thought it to be?
It took me a little while. They wanted to re-interview me about the letter. They didn't think it was brilliant evidence. They thought it discredited me, because it's very hard to win a sexual assault case anyway in the criminal justice system as it stands. But it's even harder, apparently, if it's happened to you more than once, because you can be made to look as if you were kind of asking for it, or as if you're a fantasist and you've made them all up. regardless, yeah, you kind of have to be whiter than white to be a victim of sexual assault, apparently, and having it happen to you more than once sullies you in some way.
And so you decide that you couldn't face being cross-examined by the famous man's defense team, and the charges are dropped. You decide not to go ahead, not to take the case to trial. And then I believe it's later that same week that you're on a trip after giving this interview about the letter. You're on a trip with your boyfriend by the sea to get away from it all, the media frenzy, like all of it, everything around this case. And once again, you're reading the papers, and what do you see this time around?
I saw an article that was accurately describing why the case fell apart and things that had happened in the second interview with the police. Just to be clear, I did stop talking to the police. I was also beginning to realize I didn't know who I could trust. That's why I stopped talking.
Right.
As everything I had said aloud about the case, in any context at home or within the police station, had ended up in a national newspaper. So I just thought, this letter is complicated, and I understand this is not what I thought it was, and it probably is explainable, but I don't know if I can put myself through this. I don't know who I can trust, and that's why I stopped talking. Yeah, so then the press interest in me becomes really intense, because suddenly they realize, oh, she can talk now. Like, when the charges are dropped, there's nothing sub judice about this. We can offer her loads of money to talk. So I turned down loads of money because I wanted my anonymity, and I wanted to protect my family and myself, and I just wanted it all to go away. And the police removed me from my house and put me in a hotel with my boyfriend to escape the press attention. Nevertheless, a few days later on the Sunday, one of those trashier newspapers has accurate details of why the case collapsed and what happened in that interview room with the police. And the tone is kind of, it's just very disrespectful would be the best way of putting it. But just saying that just dismissing me, I suppose, and slightly celebrating the famous man. It was enough to give me a panic attack, and to push me from fear into anger.
And so that same day, you searched for journalism courses on your laptop. Why?
Yeah, so I had an argument with my boyfriend about it. I was so stressed, and our relationship was crumbling under the pressure of all of this. And he went off, and I was pacing the room. And again, the same thoughts. How is this happening? How do they know? How do they know? How do they know? How is this allowed to happen? And it just began to kind of crystallize as this ball in my stomach of, this is not okay. This is not okay, and I need to find out how this has happened, because it had cost me criminal justice at this point. And this dangerous man was walking free again. And so I Googled journalism courses. I thought, I will become a journalist myself, and I will find this out.
During the course of your studies, you meet this well-known investigative reporter, Nick Davies, and you do a bit of work for him as a researcher on his book, kind of looking into how the British press works, what goes on behind the scenes, the so-called dark arts, things like, illegal news gathering practices, which were obviously, of interest to you. You graduate, you finish your degree, and you start working as a documentary film producer. You kind of fall out of touch with Nick. And then one day, a few years down the line, you're on a train and you kind of glance over someone's shoulder and you see an article by Nick that catches your attention. So can you take me to that moment?
Yeah. So I had, for a while, been obsessively gathering information about how the newspapers get their news, how the police get their news. I had ring binders in my bedroom, with titles on them. I was learning, really old school, yeah. I was learning about, how newsrooms work. And I'd never stopped doing that, actually. But I had also learned documentary filmmaking, as you say, and had a day job. And this Guardian article said £1 million paid out to victims of phone hacking, something like that. I haven't got that quite right. And that was the first time I saw the phrase phone hacking. And I was like, what is phone hacking? So, I read the article, and it said it is hacking into people's voicemails to surveil them and to find out as much information as you can. And in those days, we used voicemails like we use voice notes now. You know, you would ramble on to your friends about anything and everything. And I began to wonder whether phone hacking was how my secrets were stolen when my case was live, was with the Met.
And you then get in touch with Nick again and ask if you can work with him on some of his investigations.
Yes, ultimately, I persuaded Nick to take me on a second time. And he wanted me to specifically speak to reporters and former reporters at these newspapers to find out how they gathered news, which is exactly why I trained as a journalist. I was in exactly the place I had wanted to be.
And we should say that at this point, you know, in 2007, there was one reporter at this newspaper and one private investigator who had been convicted for phone hacking. But the higher ups at the newspaper said they were kind of rogue operators. They had no idea what was going on. It was just these two bad apples. But Nick believed that this was not the case, and you were helping him to uncover that.
We were not only speaking to reporters, we were trying to find victims of phone hacking who could write to the police and say, did I appear in this private investigator's notebooks? And the famous man's name was in a list that he gave me. Of course, Nick didn't know anything about my background, but he thought the famous man may have been a victim of phone hacking from one of his sources. I don't know who all his sources were. And so I thought, well, if he's in there, I could surely be in there. And again, that's exactly why I had trained as a journalist. I mean, this is what I wanted to find out. But I didn't want to tell Nick everything about my past. So I secretly wrote out on my own behalf to the Met Police, the London Police, and said, am I in this person's notebooks? And so then I began this kind of dual investigation. I was investigating overtly for Nick and covertly for myself.
Why didn't you want to tell Nick about, your own story?
I think I've still found it very hard to speak my own story. I didn't want people to know, sexual violence leaves you with a massive, healthy dollop of shame, and shame makes you want to hide, doesn't make you want to talk. So also every time I had spoken, it hadn't gone that well for me.
So it's 3 months after you email the Met Police, the Metropolitan Police, to ask them if your name is on this database, that you finally get a response from them. What do they write you back?
Yeah, 3 months later, ping, into my inbox comes an email from the Met Police saying that my name does appear to have been of interest to this private investigator.
Of interest?
Doesn't necessarily mean you were phone hacked, but you and your boyfriend's names and numbers
appeared in his notebook.
Yeah.
And what do you do then?
I still don't tell Nick the truth. I called him up and I said, what should I do if one of the sources I speak to who you suspect has been phone hacked? Who should they contact? And he said they should contact a top media lawyer. Her name's Charlotte Harris, who'd been doing a lot of that work with him. And she will then help them potentially bring a civil claim against the newspaper group.
So then, soon after, together with this media lawyer, together with Charlotte Harris, you go to the Metropolitan Police headquarters to look at these notebooks, to look at your name in these notebooks. What do you see? What had he written about you?
Yes, that was another very frightening moment, to realize that you had been spied on and to see it written down. It's another violation, really. My name, and he got my date of birth wrong. My friend to whom I'd written the letter that ended up kind of ending the court case, her name, her address, her date of birth. Next to my name, he'd written fragile. And that slightly blew my mind, because I thought, how does he know that? Did he hear that in my voice, or has someone told him that I was fragile at the time that I had, the court case was falling apart? How weird that he should know.
How were you feeling in that room? Looking,
I freaked out again. I mean, I don't remember leaving. I don't remember getting home. What I do remember is that I kind of, a bit like I behaved post the assault itself, I kind of closed all my curtains and I curled up on my bed and I turned my phone off and I just sank into this kind of pit of fear, I suppose, and of shame. Just like, what am I trying to do? Who am I trying to fight? Why am I taking these people on? They're going to trample me. They've already trampled me. Their reach is so goes so far, and
I mean, you also find out that though this private investigator was clearly spying on you and trying to find things out about you, he actually didn't have your number. He had the number of another Jenny Evans, like absurdly, kind of darkly, comically. So you concluded that that wasn't how the newspapers had gotten your private information, and that actually it was likely to have been leaked by the police. And it was, around this time that you also finally decide to come clean to Nick too. What drives that? Why do you
yeah,
finally tell Nick?
I finally told Nick. The chronology is slightly different, but I told Nick in the wake of this little mini breakdown that I was having seen my name in the private investigators' papers, because I stopped delivering for him, and he quite rightly questioned what I was doing and where I had been and what was going on. And I remember that I was so frightened of telling him that my teeth were chattering when I did it. But I told him the truth. I told him everything. And I kind of took a deep breath, expecting him to tell me off for putting his investigation in jeopardy, for having an agenda. He didn't shout. He took a deep sigh, a deeply sad sigh. And he said that when he was a child, he had experienced violence and wasn't looked after in the way he should have been. And it had given him a lifelong hatred of bullies. So he said, the way to deal with bullies is to stand up to them, and we can stand up to these guys together if you still feel you can. So I agreed.
What did it mean to you to, hear that he had your back?
It was hugely moving. It still is. It's such a relief to feel that level of fear and shame and share it and not be shamed, I suppose. Because actually what had happened when I had shared those shameful secrets before is that they had been used to shame me, which is like the worst thing. It's the last thing that you need. And yeah, he did the opposite. He looked after me, and has done ever since. Yeah, he's a good man.
So you continue working together, and then you actually go off and you produce two documentaries in very quick succession, about what's going on at this newspaper. And then for a while the newspaper continues to deny the extent of what's going on, but following your investigations, also of course the Millie Dowler case, the case of the missing girl whose phone they hacked into, the newspaper announces that it's going to publish its final issue and close down. How did that feel for you on a personal level, like knowing that your investigations, your work, contributed to that, and that you kind of helped expose, the people, the newspaper that exposed you?
Yeah, it was the newspaper that wrote the article when my case collapsed. It was the article that pushed me over the edge into journalism, the one that caused the knot of anger in my stomach. That was the one that ended up being closed down. I felt very emotional because they bullied us all. They bullied a nation in a way. I felt a huge sense of relief, like the bullies have been brought down. It's a bit like David and Goliath. I felt part of a movement that was really using journalism as it should, to expose these wrongs and to impact the way that the world works and the way that we understand how things should be, kind of in a moral sense. So it felt good, and maybe it felt a bit powerful. Maybe my power had been removed from me multiple times in those violations, and finally I had a little bit of it back.
Also, in the course of your investigation, it emerged that police officers had been paid for information, which is illegal. Some officers were convicted, but no one was convicted for leaking your specific story. Did you feel any sense of, vindication?
The head of the Metropolitan Police, London's police force, resigned because his links with these newspapers were considered too close, and then his deputy resigned. So they were really big resignations. That was a huge shake-up. And, Nick's reporting and all the work that those lawyers did and other journalists definitely contributed to that, plus our own dispatches on Channel 4. Yes, but trying to seek answers myself, the second investigation, my investigation into what happened to me, the reason I was there, as with so much corruption, it had been covered up so effectively. I did complain to the Metropolitan Police, and they did do an investigation for me, but they kind of came back with a report that exonerated themselves, surprisingly, surprise, surprise, and it was a bit of a whitewash. But this is the way corruption works. Like when you're not looking at that high level stuff, like those big resignations, when you're looking at like a department's name is changed and then the files are lost and then, somebody dies and everything gets blamed on that person. That's what happened in my case. They just quietly shift the facts.
At this point, are you okay with that, not having a definitive answer about exactly what happened?
I was not okay with that. No, in fact, the ball of anger remained, and again, I thought this is not okay. I've complained, I have followed due process, and it is impossible to hold someone accountable because you've covered it up so effectively that there's no way of finding out how my information was leaked. And also, I had requested, for example, that they pull phone records, but they had said, oh, it's too expensive to do that. So at the point at which the police kind of exonerated themselves from any accountability for what happened to me and my secrets, I contacted a media lawyer who I knew worked in human rights and media law.
And so it's with this lawyer's help that, you still don't get clarity, you still don't get definitive answers, but you do eventually get an apology from the Metropolitan Police and a settlement of, tens of thousands of pounds. Were you happy with that apology? Did it feel like enough? Did it feel like closure?
At first, I was emotional when I saw it because, again, it's hard to state how, when you've been feeling so exposed and so full of shame, and how when someone validates that experience and, for example, apologizes or sees you or hears you or understands you, it's very moving. It's a very emotional experience. So I cried when I first saw that they had apologized.
Have you kept the letter?
Oh yeah.
We did reach out to the Metropolitan Police for comment on Jenny's story, but we did not hear back. And I mean, you were able to use the money to turn a new leaf in your own life.
Yeah, this is where the civil law system becomes really important, I think, and it's a reason why I've trained as a lawyer myself, because it was a life-changing sum of money. I mean, tens of thousands of pounds for someone who comes from a background with very little money is life-changing. And my husband and I ultimately used it to have IVF, and now we have a little boy who is wonderful. But it's a rough form of justice by the civil justice system measuring things in money. It's kind of crude, but in terms of going back again to that feeling of validation and of being believed, it is a real kind of full stop and underline. We believe you, and here is some compensation for the bad thing that happened to you. And when you've been fighting for anyone to just acknowledge that a bad thing has happened to you, that's a huge thing. That is also life-changing. The emotional shift that brings is also life-changing.
You trained to become a journalist, to uncover wrongs, within the British press and the police. And, as you say, you've now retrained to be a lawyer. Are there more wrongs in the world that you're hoping to right? Are there people, who you now want to protect, like some of the lawyers you met protected you?
Yes, certainly I'm interested in working with women and in sexual violence. But really, I think, there is a message here about accountability. I'm making sure that factions of state or the most important powerful facets that we have to rely on, we've got no choice but to rely on when we're hurt, can be held accountable. And that's really what I want to do.
And I mean, on a personal level, like that response to injustice, right? Like, I don't know, you didn't just kind of like crawl in a hole. You were like, I'm going to get to the bottom of this. I'm going to dedicate years of my life to solving this thing. And then now, again, dedicate years of my life to becoming a lawyer. Like, where do you think that comes from? Is it something you've always had?
Good question. I think my family were politically active when I was young and quite campaigning. And I think that's probably went in. I think it was a matter of survival, probably when I got pushed into that trauma space, that kind of fight or flight space, despite the deep levels of shame that I had and have and still kind of have to fight against. There is some fight in me. And perhaps that's because I've had to learn how to fight.
Thank you so much, Jenny, for sharing your story with us. Jenny's book is called Don't Let It Break You, Honey. I'm Asya Fuchs, and thank you for watching Lives Less Ordinary. If you want more fascinating true life stories, subscribe to Lives Less Ordinary wherever you get your BBC podcasts. Or you can find us here on the BBC World Service YouTube channel. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we love to hear from you. So leave your comments below. Take care.